Hello, welcome to Vienna Lager water treatment. This is a 77 kH residual alkalinity water with 3.5 grams of calcium chloride and 1.5 grams of sulfate added to 35 litres of total water, which is in the kettle there. I now carefully mix the salts into the water to make sure it's all in solution. The water is made up of 50/50 RO and Colchester Tap water. So once everything's dissolved and the lactic acid is added, I'll run the water to the HLT ready for the sparge. Once the sparge water's ran to the HLT, I start the kettle heating for the mash water. Mill 3.5 kilograms of Vienna malt and 1.3 kilos of Pilsner malt ready for the mashing. Just helping the last little bit into the grain mill there, the grain father grain mill. For the settings for the grain mill, I use the grain father grain mill on number 4 speed settings and 6 gap setting, which gives a good crush size, a good mix of crush for free flowing wort and conversion. Now the strike wort is ready, it's time to add the grains and mix them well to avoid any dough balls. Moving on to mashing in. So when you're adding the grains into the mash tun, or the all-in-one system as this is with the grain father G40, then you want to be making sure that you're adding in the grains slowly, methodically, and making sure that you're mixing in the grains to avoid dough balls, which can affect the efficiency of your beer. As you will see, with the mash getting thicker, now I've added all the grains and emptied the bucket into the mash tun. I'm now taking my time to make sure that there's no dough balls. I'm being quite methodical about how I'm stirring at different levels, and chopping into the grains, into the grist, and making sure that everything's as wet as possible. The grain father G40 is basically a big rim system, a big rims tube. So what this allows you to do is circulate the hot wort from the bottom, circulate it through the grains that you're mashing in, and allowing the temperature to be maintained throughout the mash. Time to put the lid on and start the timer. Once the mash time is started, heat the sparge water. After 5 to 10 minutes, pull off a portion of the wort to test the pH. Test within the range of 5.2 to 5.6. To test when the conversion is always finished, do an iodine test. To do this, put some wort on a white plate and drop a couple of drops of an iodine tincture into the wort on the white plate. Test to see if there's any black in the iodine. If the iodine turns black, then the starch is still in, that aren't being converted yet, so mash is not finished. In this instance, you can see that the iodine colour remains an iodine colour, therefore the mash conversion is finished. With conversion complete, I now started to take off roughly a third of the grains out of the mash and put them into a stainless steel pot to heat to complete a decoction mash. Decoction mashing enables you to give extra depth of flavour into the beer with melanoidins, which are typically umami meaty flavours, but they also give an element of background sweetness and more body to the beer. Now the decoction is separate in the separate pots and heating. Gently bring to a boil and then gently simmer for 10 minutes. Once the decoction starts boiling or simmering away, make sure that you keep stirring it to avoid it sticking to the bottom of the pan. The last thing you want is acrid flavours from burnt malt. After 10 minutes of boiling, the mash is obviously darker, you can see in the picture. It's now time to put the mash back into the main mash tun and complete the mash out step, and then sparge. So mash out. The mash out step raises the temperature of the mash to 75 degrees Celsius, setting the sugar profile of the beer. No more conversion will happen once you've mashed out. Now it's time to sparge. Use the sparge water from the HLT that you've originally heated up to 75 degrees Celsius to rinse out any remaining sugars in the grains in the mash basket. You can see I'm using the hose coming out from HLT with just a piece of copper pipe, 15mm copper pipe that I've flattened one end off and just cut some grooves into, just to allow it to come out, and then I manually sparge to rinse the grains. So now we've moved on to the boil. Here you can see the proteins forming on top of the beer as it approaches the boil. These start creating a foam on top, which I personally prefer to stir back in before I add the 60-minute hops. You'll see in a moment I add a hop spider because I'm using pellets in this, and I don't want pellets to get caught into the CFC, the counterflow chiller that I use for chilling the wort. It's essential to sanitize your chiller before you put any wort through it to put into your FV. The FV is the fermenter, and it's important to make sure that you get the internal temperature of the counterflow chiller above 75 degrees to sanitize it. It's best to do this for at least 10 minutes. With 10 minutes of the boil remaining, add half a protofloc tablet. The protofloc tablet is also known as kettle fining. Kettle finings coagulate all the proteins, ensuring that you present a clear beer. I'll be using a wet yeast for this beer, so as it's a wet yeast, I'll be adding yeast nutrients and oxygenating the wort. Use 5 grams of Young's yeast nutrients. At the end of the boil, I held 40 grams of Hallertau Blanc at 80 degrees for 20 minutes to the whirlpool stage. Now with the boil finished and the whirlpool over, it's time to chill the wort down to around 15 to 16 degrees. As you'll see, this is a little pigtail going on to create some back pressure to hold the wort onto the oxygen stone as I turn on the oxygen for 30 seconds. In a second you'll see the clear wort turning into a more fluffy, oxygenated, thicker, creamy looking wort, which lays on top of the rest of the wort and the yeast, which is getting mixed in, and you'll see that the oxygenation with wet yeast or reusing a previously dry yeast, anything other than Gen 1 yeast that isn't dry, basically you need to make sure that you oxygenate the wort and also add yeast nutrients. I oxygenate my wort with 2 30-second blasts, one 30-second blast at the front, this I'm showing here, and then another 30-second blast towards the end of transfer from the kettle to the fermenter. This seems to work really well, and as you'll see in a moment, after roughly 12 hours you can see activity in the airlock. This is the morning after, roughly 12 hours after the end of brew day. You see the yeast happily creating alcohol, as shown by the CO2 bubbles in the airlock.